Hello, everyone. I'm Slava Gerovitch from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Welcome to the joint event by two virtual platforms. First is Colloquium for the History of Russian and Soviet Science, called CHORUS, which we run jointly with Eglė Rindzevičiūtė and Alexei Kozhevnikov. And the second platform is History of Science in Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe. These two friendly platforms have a bit different focus. We at CHORUS run monthly colloquia, where scholars in the field report on their recent or work in progress. And History of Science in Central Eastern and Southeastern Europe. This group focuses on sharing information about recent publications, conferences, and we hold these joint events, book discussions. So today's event is dedicated to the discussion of the very recent book by Eglė Rindzevičiūtė from Kingston University, London, The Will to Predict, Orchestrating the Future Through Science. And we have two wonderful commentators today, Ksenia Tatarchenko and Teresa Ashe. Let me start by introducing Eglė. Eglė Rindzevičiūtė is an associate professor of criminology and sociology in the Department of Criminology, Politics and Sociology at Kingston University, London, the UK. She is the author of The Power of Systems, How Policy Sciences Opened Up the Cold War World with Cornell, and the book we discussed today, The Will to Predict, Orchestrating the Future Through Science, also with Cornell. She's a principal investigator in nuclear spaces, communities, locations, and materialities of nuclear cultural heritage, funded as part of the European Union's Joint Programming Initiative for Cultural Heritage. Her current research interests involve the intellectual history and sociology of governance of complexity, particularly the emergence of global environmental governance and the digitality, the shifting forms of scientific expertise in public policy, as well as material culture of Cold War science and technology and its heritagization. So welcome, Eglė. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Slava, for inviting me and giving me this chance. And thank you, everyone, for coming to this colloquium. I will try to share my slides. Okay, so so what I'm going to talk today about is really just like a summary, if it is even possible to summarize a book that came out last year. And I understand that some of you have read the introduction that the link to which was press circulated. And I know that at least two speakers have read the book very thoroughly and already participated in similar seminars. So to them, I would like to apologize if I'm going to repeat myself. But I'm really very happy to have this opportunity to talk about the book to the rest of you. Okay, so the book itself, initially when I started writing this book, I wanted to write a book about how different Russian scientists were trying to predict scientifically the future of Russia and to kind of do the history of those predictions. But then eventually it somehow struck to me that although it would be interesting as a kind of scientific like a study of scientific culture, it's just not so easy to do, because I had this very nagging question, what is scientific prediction? And I realized that although I've been using that term in my previous work and I've been reading about predictions, I never quite got a very clear answer for myself. What is prediction and what makes predictions scientific? So really the book then very quickly took a very different turn, and it became a sort of archaeology of different scientific approaches to prediction. Of course, this is not the first attempt to do something like that. Actually, there is a very hybrid context of research where scientific predictions are analyzed from very different perspectives. So for example, in work like Jenny Anderson, all sorts of different types of scientific predictions like futurology or scenario making or even decision science that try to model chains of decisions is studied as part of institutional politics of the Cold War and globalization. While other authors like Elke Ziefried have analyzed the development of future studies, looking specifically at this very hybrid discipline of future studies that emerged also in the 40s, 50s as part of the Cold War science. A fairly recent book by Christian Dyer is really interesting and relevant here because he focuses at the early history of forecasting techniques at Rand Corporation in the US, and he traces the influence of European positivists and particularly logical positivists who transferred the approaches to the analytical approaches and logical approaches to prediction and try to kind of operationalize them into practical prediction techniques. Then a related, but I would argue a really rather different kind of study is being developed as part of environmental and climate science history, like in the volume edited by Matthias Heyman and colleagues. And this is a really interesting book. So we are looking at different scientific communities within Earth system or climate science. And we look at the very particular technical approaches to prediction that those communities use. So we really try to unpack the diversity in terms of scientific predictions. And then there are, of course, kind of big histories of more like cultural histories of predicting the future. And some of them, and that's a kind of very long-standing tradition of cultural history. Very many of such histories have been written as some sort of political utopia studies. So looking into cultural imaginaries of the future. And those kinds of studies, we also sometimes would include scientific imaginaries of the future, but we would kind of include them as yet another example of culture, right? And would be interesting in what sort of pictures of the future those scientific utopias generate. And here we have actually a lot of research done in that spirit to detail state socialist, communist, but also kind of Russian cultural imaginaries of the future. The book that I particularly would like to emphasize here is Jamie Pietruska's study Looking Forward, which actually really very interestingly combines a cultural history, but at the same time, a very fine history of statistical forecasting, where she traces the emergence of statistical forecasting in the 19th century in the United States. And when she looks how that form of knowledge intertwines with other utopian or maybe very vernacular, like, fortune reading modes of dealing with the future. Right, so, and very small, so really a wonderful and very diverse field in which I situate my book. But what these studies do not do, and what I try to do with my book, is to kind of make a very strong argument that scientific predictions are not really always about the future. That future emerges as a kind of side effect, or it is forged through predictions, rather than, so I kind of try to probe into that and to destabilize that kind of analytical connection between scientific prediction and the future, which appeared to guide a lot of scholarship up until now. Okay, so what is this prediction? When I had to answer this question to myself, and that was really very difficult, I was very lucky to have a visiting position at the Department for History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. When doing that, and I very quickly realized that there is this huge tradition in philosophy of science that looks into scientific prediction, and that I'm totally not equipped to deal with it thoroughly, because there is this huge internal debate, part of which comes from logical positivism and the philosophy of proof and the philosophy of inference. It gets amazingly technical. Then there is, of course, this cultural history of engagements with the future in different cultures, not only European, but also Chinese and Indian and others. And again, I'm not equipped to deal with that. However, in the book, I try to contextualize in a very kind of broad brush way the history of Soviet-Russian predictions in the context of a wider European approach to prediction. Okay, so prediction is a form of knowledge to engage with events which are developing, which are evolving. And it's interesting to look into the semantics of different European words like l'avenir or futurum. And we all hint that there is something in transformation. So to predict, to engage with future is not to know what is, but is to deal with something which is becoming, which is growing. So the interesting bit for me was to see how these different modes of engaging with this form of reality, which is under continuous transformation, how come that some approaches then became considered scientific and others not scientific, like astrology and so on. Okay, and they do a bit of contextualization of that, pointing to this very kind of long-standing debate about different types of sciences. And where you have natural sciences that presumably focus more on causes and operate with cause-effect model, where mantic or conjectural science focuses on signs and doesn't try to establish causes, but tries to establish patterns and some kind of meaningful relation between signs. So some sort of semiotical approach to reading reality. And prediction precisely emerges as a form of knowledge which belongs to the mantic, to the conjectural and semiotic epistemology. But what's very interesting, what happens with the 18th and 19th century, is that this expectation that prediction should be somehow based on causal way of thinking infuses attempts to predict. And so my whole book is a kind of attempt to point at this conflict that scientific predictions that emerged in the 20th century and more specifically during the Cold War. They're really mainly about reading signs and adapting, adjusting to reality, to external processes. But there is this cultural expectation that comes from the notion of what is modern science, which forces predictions to somehow engage with causes or causalities. And that creates a greater demand for certainty, which then causes problems for predictions because they almost always fail. And when failure is considered as a sign of weak science. So it's a kind of loop. Misunderstanding maybe would be of different epistemologies would probably be a too strong a word, but it's something that I wanted to emphasize in the book. So it's kind of philosophical, really. Okay, now I really have to go very fast. I found it really very interesting when looking into literature that the transitional moment during which conjectural and predictive science forms of knowledge were accepted into the canon of proper science was medicine. That operated with a model of diagnosis and prognosis. And then when looking at the early attempts to kind of engage with large evolving processes, would it be economy or demography or exploitation of resources, that kind of governmental planning really borrowed discourses from medicine because it appeared to fit, so is the population healthy? Is it growing? Is it declining? How can it be cured? Can statisticians help providing information that would help to predict and intervene and, securing the viability of population or economy. So to me, it was very interesting to track those discourses, and not just discourses, I would say they are models of using expertise and what is expected from predictive expertise. Okay, very quickly, again, to me, I really felt very uncomfortable saying anything about the 19th century Russia, but I just couldn't resist because it's just so interesting, and I really thought that somebody should do history like Jamie Petruska, should do a proper history of scientific predictions in the 19th century Russian Empire, the development of weather forecasts, the forecasting of natural resources, population forecast, and such things. To me, it was interesting to trace the emerging model which came together with the French positivism, that prediction becomes established as part of modern science. And furthermore, it becomes a requirement for any science to be able to predict evolving phenomena, to somehow, and to predict and to explain those forms of evolution. And it was meant to be a part of pragmatic use of knowledge, so that knowledge is not important just for its own sake, but it's fundamentally applied. You want to do predictions because you want to intervene and change something. Okay. So really moving very, very quickly. So that kind of interventionist mode and productive mode of prediction really comes from the history of European science in general. But what is interesting, but it gets really, really amplified with the introduction of cybernetics, which offers a very kind of elegant and very operationalized through digital technology model for such kind of diagnostic, prognostic and interventionist use of knowledge. The only thing that what the cybernetic model does is that it almost kind of pushes prediction before information. And that kind of aligns with sibling approaches to prediction that evolved in the fields of neurophysiology, maybe even genetics in some ways. So I found it very interesting to trace those parallel developments. So prediction somehow becomes not a kind of form of weak knowledge or science, but it becomes almost like the initial source of scientific knowledge, but only at a very particular scale and in relation to very particular phenomena. And this is what I really then try to do in my book, to kind of show that, okay, so it's a kind of obvious thing that, of course, reality operates at very different scales, and therefore we have different sciences to engage with those different scales. But what my book tries to do is to say that, look, the notion of prediction is different at different scale of scientific knowledge. And it's very interesting when those scales start to mix up. And that's part of my story, that, for example, in the case of economic and social forecasting, predicting future economic or social development in the Soviet Union, but also elsewhere, was precisely the confusion of a very micro scale of cybernetics and a very macro scale of a national economy and population. And I think it adds to this larger argumentation how cybernetics as part of as a methodology for planning and management, why it failed in policy making. Of course, it failed because it was applied at the scale which was not appropriate for that model. So it was interesting for me to think along those lines. Okay, so because I'm not really a proper historian, I think I will probably continue saying that all the time. I always find myself asking sociological questions. So to me, that immediately became a question of organization. So how is predictive scientific expertise organized? And I don't really like the idea that that history is about learning lessons, but could a lesson be learned that maybe a better orchestration, a better kind of alignment of different types of scientific predictions to different scales of action would contribute to a better policy use of scientific expertise. So that's a kind of parallel argument that I'm pursuing in the book. Okay, and now I really have to wrap it up. So in terms of case studies, so that's like a major argument, what I try to do with the book, both the history and kind of classification of different scientific epistemologies of prediction, and a sort of sociological argument about the appropriate uses of scientific prediction in policymaking. And I unfold those arguments through a set of case studies. Now, those case studies, I think in the end, they are sort of representative, but they're of course not comprehensive. So it would have been fantastic to have a chapter, for instance, about geophysical predictions, for instance, like earthquake forecasting, very interesting epistemological discussions there, or genetics or biology, or even medicine, right? But it's just not the materials with which I worked. So I was departing from the materials with which I worked, which came from the system cybernetic history. So first I started with a history of economic and social forecasting, and I built up that study by looking at Nikolai Kondratyev's work on scientific prediction in economic planning, which was very much eye-opening for me. I think there is just so much more to be learned about Kondratyev's views and how they connected with global debates about business cycles. Then partially through biography, because I was myself exposed to Piotr Shchedrovitsky practice in the very late 90s, early 2000s in Moscow. I retained interest, and I was very curious to unpack Georgy Shchedrovitsky's idea of prospective reflexivity, where he takes, where he tries to develop science to organize and produce mutual predictability in collective behavior. So that falls into the history of cognitive psychology, I would say, and the history of scientific approaches to management. The sibling theory, of course, is the notion of reflexive control developed by Vladimir Lefebvre. And what is interesting about that is that it also reveals that the performative notion of prediction, which tries to produce alternative realities by creating deception. So prediction is not always about finding out the truth, it's about creating alternative worlds. And then finally, I was looking at the limits of scientific prediction at the very high levels of complexity. And the final chapter looks at the writings by Nikita Moiseyev, who really presented a philosophy probing the limits of cybernetic, but also positivist notions of prediction at the global level of both in terms of natural phenomena like global Earth system, but also at the level of international and global governance. Yeah, so I really would like to see in the future this research growing. Maybe we should move from risk studies to prediction studies. I really think that would encourage engaging with maybe different types of sources and maybe kind of recentering the existing canon of the history of the Cold War science, maybe even connecting it more to what was happening in the 19th century. I think there is that very interesting cultural legacy of how cultural expectations about predictability which have this long durée, how they continue informing more recent forms of scientific knowledge. So that would be great to do. And I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you so much, Eglė. And it sounds really fascinating. Like a book is opening up a new field of studies, prediction studies. So let's now move on to the two commentators. So let's start with Teresa Ashe, who is a staff tutor lecturer in economics at the Open University in the UK. She manages teaching in economics, teaches in environmental geography, and her scholarship focuses on the power of expert knowledge in international relations. Her research areas include the history of climate change, environmental movements, and environmental journalism in communications. Her research particularly looks at the similarities and differences between environmental thoughts in the US and Russia during and after the Cold War. Her recent publications include a chapter on Russian climate skepticism in climatic change, and in introduction to the volume she co-edited on climate change discourse in Russia, past and present. Teresa?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. And thanks, Eglė, for that like whistle-stop tour through a very long, interesting, very complex topic. I was asked to review this. So I've read this a couple of months ago. And I had the chance then to kind of write a very kind of detailed, objective, this is why this is so interesting in my area of topic. And I'm going to take this opportunity, if I may, to be a little bit more subjective in my appreciation, because one of the things I loved about this book is it somehow managed to hit every single thing I've been geeky about in the last 20 years and bring it together in the sense that it felt coherent and it felt like, oh, of course, that's why I was interested in all these disparate areas. So to follow that through, I have to just talk a little bit about me for a few minutes. I started off in philosophy. I was very interested in AI. I was interested in cybernetics and rationality, philosophy of mind, but also in political economics. And that was kind of the direction I went in. I studied economics. I studied global political economics, and then I went on to do a doctorate in environmental thought. And I got very interested in the question of knowledge within the international relations of climate change. So I went in to do a PhD about the UNFCCC, and I was interested in climate skepticism and thought, oh, I'm sure there's a book on that I can read, and then I'll have done it and I can get on with my thesis. And I quickly found there wasn't a book yet on what I wanted to know about, which was around the epistemology of how we know things about climate change, how we make sense of them politically, how our governance works, and why some people can't cope with certain kinds of truths, and what that says culturally, and how the science of that works. So I ended up spending my time in my thesis looking at the relationship between nature and society, the relationship between power and knowledge, between science and the state, particularly in the West. It ended up being quite centered on American thought, the development of environmental ideas, and then the sort of anti-environmental counter movement. And when I got to the end of my PhD, I felt like there was something missing, because so much of the narrative that I talked about was Cold War. And so much of it was about Russia. And yet Russia seemed absent from the literature. It was never really Russia that was being talked about. It was American projections of Russia and American imaginations of Russia. So I started as a postdoc to find out more about Russia, and I'm always very conscious that I'm not doing it as an expert. I'm doing it as somebody situated in Western ideas. My linguistic and cultural understanding is Western. It's much more kind of akin to America, while being critical friend, not being quite situated in that. Whereas when I come to Soviet and Russian histories, I'm often doing it in a very kind of anthropological, this isn't culturally or linguistically easy for me. And therefore, the vividness and the richness of being able to make comparisons between the experiences that environmental thought in America was having and experiences in Russia, that somehow gives me a deeper insight into the area that I research. So I've become really interested in Soviet Russia, but I'm also very aware that I'm here as a sort of like, this is not my kind of comfort area. This is where I challenge my understanding. So one of the things that I massively appreciated about this book was the coherence and elegance that was brought to interests that I've had in AI, interests that I've had in economics, complex systems, environmental thought, the relationship between nature and society, how understandings of the ontology of what the world is like shape understandings of governance and how politics is imagined and how economics is imagined. So I have this kind of personal appreciation for it. On the other hand, I also think there's just something incredibly useful about looking at Russian history. It doesn't get done enough. There's too much focus on, so particularly on America as the paradigm for something like environmental thought, which means that for me, just this very kind of rich historical understanding of a particular cultural experience prediction is just valuable in itself, regardless of how much else you can get out of this book. But thirdly, the thing that sparked off so much thought for me was to think about these sort of deeper questions of modernity and reflexivity and efficiency and control in a society that shares those commitments to modernity and industrialization, but is taking a different political, economic, and governance expression of what that modernity will look like. So I was particularly interested in questions of scientific persuasiveness. And I think Eglė just kind of mentioned about different scales of prediction and different applicabilities of prediction. And for me, there's also an interest in sort of different geographies of prediction, different understandings of what we can expect knowledge to do, and how different cultural groups and also different times. I felt like there was this really strong sense of the genealogy of these ideas. And from looking at climate skepticism in America, this strong sense that the ontology of Cold War scientists was just different from Earth system scientists who were using computing to understand this massively complex system. And the challenges of dissonance between different periods of scientific understanding of what they were trying to understand, what they were trying to do, and different political understandings of that science. So that was what sparked off lots of ideas for me and helped me to kind of think about how, in understanding the Russian experience of grappling with that shift towards Earth system science that creates a governance of milieu rather than the governance of cybernetic course correction, allowed me to kind of take that back into the American example and think about how that was grappled with in two different cultural contexts with the same commitments to modernity. So I'm afraid I'm not sure how long I've been speaking, but those were the three things that for me were deeply appreciated about this book. However, I also note that this book touches on so many relevant things at the moment in terms of the complexity of the economic system, where AI may go next, the situation in Ukraine. There are so many interesting and useful insights that it can say something to a vast range of different research paradigms. And I wanted to thank Eglė and say how much I enjoyed reviewing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. I guess we'll have the second commentary and then Eglė will respond to both, right? It's okay, Eglė? Or would you like to go respond specifically now?
I can actually respond very quickly now. Maybe that would make it easier than to transition to questions.
Right, sure.
Yeah, so thank you, Teresa. You're just being way too generous. And I'm so glad that the book speaks to so many agendas. I guess I try to do that, but maybe sometimes, to be a little bit of self-critical, it came at the cost of going really in depth in terms of actual history of science. But when you have to do these 300 pages, otherwise publishers will really hate you. So there were very many difficult decisions to be done. But you finished by saying about milieu approach and this kind of attempt to organize predictive knowledge in the context of global complexity, and that's really interesting. I think in the case of Moiseyev and this kind of emerging idea that maybe decisions and behaviors could be channeled through milieux and through kind of ongoing mutual adjustment rather than guided through input-output signals as some kind of pre-programmed program. Interestingly, it also speaks to Western approaches which were developed within urban planning and design. So I recently found out that in the 60s and 70s in Germany, but also internationally, there was this movement to develop critical design approaches. And that was very much kind of milieu, kind of creating experimental self-regulating environments as laboratories to test how people behave and how we could develop more efficient and sustainable forms of transport, but also living in urban environments. So it's kind of interesting for that, that this kind of parametric thinking, whether it would be parameters of logistics or if it would be parameters in the case of Moiseyev, he was kind of inspired by mathematics and kind of modeling turbulent processes, how it leads away from information or kind of from programmed informational steering, because environmental steering, it could well be informational, but it wouldn't be pre-programming. It would be kind of co-evolving this behavioral designs. So this kind of movement from digitality and early computing into designing interactive behavioral systems, and that is interesting to track during in the Cold War Soviet science, because now we live with early forms of implementing it through self-learning algorithms and smart things and networks and so on. But the kind of conceptual frame of considering that those things really goes back very interestingly to at least to the 1960s. And to be honest, when going through those sources, and even Shchedrovitsky and Lefebvre and Moiseyev, I didn't find many of those ideas outdated, because we spoke to those issues that behavioral regulation through informational or material environments have. So yeah, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So our next commentator is Ksenia Tatarchenko, who is assistant professor of science and technology studies at the College of Integrative Studies at the Singapore Management University. She has published a number of articles on the history of the Soviet information age, including its distinct materiality, the alternative algorithmic rationality, and professionalization cultures. Her first book, entitled Soviet Siberia, the Novosibirsk Science Center and the Late Soviet Politics of Expertise, is coming out this fall. She's currently working on the second book manuscript, entitled The Algorithmic Community and the Universal Machine, and on a smaller project tracing the history of the Soviet translation and reception of Alan Turing's 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Ksenia?
All right, I hope you can hear me fine, because I have like people at home now, so let's see how it works. Let me share my screen, and I have to admit that we also, like Eglė and me, we started having those conversations maybe in the same format of writing a review and also like on a panel, right? But I also have to say, like, by no means like participating in this event is repetitive, or hearing you speak was not insightful, right? It's actually the opposite. I have an immediate reaction. I'm like, oh my God, why haven't I thought about it earlier? Now, when you're speaking about safe regulation of rules, I'm like, Baikal and the late Soviet attempts and re-regulated differently. It looks like we may want to talk about orchestration in this context. All right, so this is just to say that I think I absolutely agree with Teresa that this is an opportunity to share. Or maybe I can do play, right? So you don't need to see my notes, right? So to share the more personal reaction compared to kind of a more structured official review. And I just have a couple of slides to organize my own thoughts. And I guess the main thing that I wanted to stress is how much a pleasure it was to reach this book, because of kind of a genuine sense of optimism that this book conveys as an intellectual project, right? And what I mean, I think on the most general level, I think I just heard this again when Eglė was describing how she had to speak to all these different communities and just learn the subject herself. And I think this is what makes this book like a reading that seems to be open to conversations. Right, so this is not just like a statement, oh, let's talk together, right? It's like the book that invites the conversation, but it's very structured, right? But the way that formulates the problems and questions. And I think like for me as a reader, this was an incredible quality, right? And so that's kind of one reason why I think it's such a positive book, because if we talk about the ideal of interdisciplinary conversation, I think this book is a concrete step in making this happen. Well, I mean, then I think this is just to repeat what have been said, right? So yes, prediction is associated with failure, right? And so it's again, very refreshing conceptual move to think not in terms of a failure, right? Thinking differently. And again, as an intellectual project, right? It was for me, but yeah, something that I have appreciated a lot, and I think something that we should congratulate Eglė on. And finally, the very idea of orchestrating the future, right? Given that how much the book itself is oriented toward the interdisciplinary conversation, right? How it's not about failure. And suddenly there is even more, is actually not only, okay, let's revise the negative thing, there is actually something about the collective action, right? And the collective action is it is simultaneously, right, a proposition and an object of investigation, right? And this is, again, something that I thought is particularly timely, right? Particularly timely in those hard times, and especially timely for us studying the region, which is like dramatic and you don't know where to look, right? And suddenly there is a way out, at least intellectually, to think about things in a much more positive manner, right? And so like historiographically speaking, right, and this is mostly maybe to illustrate things that I have already said, right? So I think, like as many of us, we've been in this interesting position of, we are studying this huge thing, right? And we are studying it very much, especially like those of us who write in English through the concepts developed in English language historiography. I think this book is a very good exercise in showing that a book which doesn't have Soviet in its title, right, can make a statement, can make a conceptual statement, which is not all about import, right? So it's so genuinely, organically at the heart of the 20th century history of this region. I'm not sure how to call it anymore. Let's call it Soviet century for the sake of simplicity, right? But this is where it's suddenly not something that we are borrowing, right? But something which is kind of organically appropriated and shown how important this is. And I think this is why, right, again, there is a potential actually for export, right? And I do hope that this kind of question marks that appeared on the screen earlier, right, that they will be concretized into something concrete. So I think this is something that we should celebrate in our field, that we have a book, right, that actually offers concepts, positive concepts that I think can be exported. On the same line of reasoning, I think historiographically what is interesting about this book, and I think something that you'll enjoy when you have a chance to read it, is that it's not a book that is closing research subjects. It's not like, oh, and now cybernetics is covered, right? No, it's the opposite, right? It's actually the book that opens the doors, right? Is what Eglė has said. It's like, okay, she's not going in depth. Fine, right? So please come in and dig, right? And do. And so this is a book, I think, that invites conversations, invites further research. And I think, again, so this is something we're lucky to have for us who study this region and this period. And just for a personal note, for Eglė, right? I think it's also an optimistic book because actually it realizes the agenda that you yourself have set out. I've been recently looking for references on cybernetics, and I ran across, I think I saw it before, but I sort of reread this 2010 article when you make a call for an inquiry about the productive roles of cybernetics. And then I was like, well, of course you do this before, right? You've done it in your previous work, but suddenly, right, you've done it from a kind of a full force in this particular project. And so again, the kind of a practical optimism here, right? You can have an agenda and then you can keep realizing it. And so this is, I think, absolutely wonderful. I have one more slide on kind of more details about what is actually in the book. It, I think, corresponds to many things that Eglė have covered already, and we still need a couple of minutes for questions, so I'll try to summarize this very briefly. But again, as a historian, what I think was very interesting for me, and I hope for others who are still going to discover this book, is a longue durée perspective, right? You spend a lot of time summarizing things that are kind of unrelated to your case studies, right? But you bring them in dialogue, so this is not kind of time lost. We do need this technical information in order to dig into the concepts, and I think this is done again with elegance, very much as Teresa has said, right? So the organization of chapters through the concepts of prediction, I think, works very well. But at the same time, again, sort of this longue durée is not just historical one, it is the one within conversation of the present and with the things and the kind of ideas that matter to us in the 21st century. Very, very important move, I believe, is in kind of reconsidering cybernetics from the military side, and the famous Gallison's article that all of us, I guess, know about the ontology of the enemy, right? So I have been thinking through cybernetics through this frame for a very long time. I probably haven't been such a careful reader of Cybernetic Brain by Pickering. And now I think it's like time for me to reread it, and maybe thanks to you partially, right? So because there are alternative ways of thinking about cybernetics, right? Not only from the military part. And I think this is shown with strength in the book very well, with lots of details. And all of your case studies like support this particular shift, analytical shift. What else is important to highlight? I think it's, again, a fantastic book to discuss in this particular setting. I think that's the kind of the purpose of Krужок, right? Inviting people who study different aspects, different scientific disciplines. And this happens on the pages of the book as well, right? So it's not like typically we'll have a space history and then we have computer people and physics people, right? Suddenly, right, the ideas intermingle, right? And so the book covers all of those different things, right? I think we haven't had anything like this since Lawrence work, right? So I think we are, again, very well served. And of course, right, this is a short book, so you haven't covered everything, but I think the very fact that you show that this is possible, and this is possible through concepts, is something that is remarkable and works well. And again, so in terms of the questions, you're probably also familiar with my questions. This is not a new question. It's very much connected to the kind of my own interests in Russian science and technology, right? So of course, while I was reading, right, I've been like, I couldn't not to think about how come that these ideas are so powerful, they move so well, why there are all these men, like so powerful men who have authority. Is it about particular institutional structures? Actually, no, because you show different institutions. So is it about something about social structures? Is there anything about this kind of difficult category of intelligentsia? Because all of these men of ideas, right? So I think that this is where like a lot can be done and should be done, and probably this is kind of more, but you didn't set up. This is not your project, right? But I think your project, one more time, illustrates that we also need to understand kind of the social structures behind these ideas a bit better. I guess I may want to stop here. Even though I have like some other particular things that I could add one way or another, but just one more time, right? If like my general enthusiasm was not clear enough, I want to highlight that I have appreciated this book a lot. It was not an easy reading, one more time, because it is a very concentrated book, right? You shouldn't sleep on the pages, right? You really need to follow, because there are many, many actors, many, many ideas, and there are technical aspects that you have to appreciate in order to appreciate the elegance of its structure, right? So, but one more time, I would want to congratulate Eglė on and us, the readers, because we have a chance to read such a wonderful work. Thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia. Eglė, would you like to respond?
Well, Really, thank you. It's just too positive. That's really very, very kind of you, and it's just amazing to have a book so well received. But you are quite right, Ksenia. I was really thinking about, you see, many of those thinkers that the book covers, they are like men of ideas. And it's true, I didn't really go deeply into that, but you couldn't help but notice that there are certain patterns in the career. And so many of those key characters, like Moiseyev, Shadrovitzkis, Lefebvre, Kondratiev, maybe a different story, but the post-war characters, they have a formative years during World War II. Maybe Lefebvre in a very, very young age, but others either having served in the war or experienced the war. And this very idea that the economy and society had to be rebuilt after the war, I think was something that added the sense of mission. And also because of the Cold War, kind of this huge looming threat of a possible nuclear war, that the world had to be somehow pacified and that some sort of agreement or reason or rationality should be kind of brought to decision makers through science. I think there was this sense of responsibility, but of course that sense of responsibility came with social and institutional entitlement. But it's really quite interesting. I think it would be really great to do a properly social history, how ideas become agendas and how, what it takes for some ideas to become agendas. And that's probably one of the reasons why I focused on those particular cases that I chose, because these were not just ideas, these were agendas. Yeah, so what are those social structures that makes scientists entitled? When you look at the history of American, for example, Cold War science or British Cold War science, Lauren, probably you would be able to comment on that better. It's really interesting, you look at the kind of biography of Herbert Simon. So he became a foundational theorist of organizational theory. He basically made up his first book. So he refers to examples of organizational behavior, but he just came up with them on the basis of his experience, and still perceived to be like one of the best books because it's so very insightful. Simon and others, we had hugely fast-tracked careers. And one can see we were also men of ideas and we had agendas, but I'm not sure if those agendas translated in its ambition and also kind of social depth that similar ideas had in Russia. So it's really interesting. And what's also interesting is that when looking at the history of Soviet Lithuanian science, I don't see the same. So there were, again, ideas that had some kind of agendas, but were kind of more local. So maybe there is something about the colonial, globally oriented institutional character of Russian science, which added to that sense of entitlement, which is not necessarily, I don't mean it necessarily critical. I mean that all those scientists on whom I focused, what really struck me was how free they were themselves to engage in philosophizing and borrowing ideas from sibling fields and building those agendas. So this kind of entitlement, confidence, clearly there is some kind of interesting political, social, and cultural structure behind it. So perhaps a comparative study of kind of Moscow, Leningrad, Novosibirsk, Akademgorodok-centered science and other smaller science would give very interesting insight into agendas. Like in Estonia, for instance, there was some very interesting environmentally motivated decision science being developed, but it has never become like a big agenda. It was more like a technical experimentation. So yeah, that would be really, really interesting and important thing to do.
Great, thank you. So let's now open floor for questions. So if anyone has a question, please just put a question mark in the chat, And this way we will see the order of questions. It'll be easy to manage the discussion. Diana?
Hi, nice to see so many familiar faces. And congratulations on all this work. Really, really exciting to hear this. I have I'm actually really, really excited about a lot of the things that you're saying, because they're also echoing some of the things that I've been kind of reflecting on as I've made a little bit like a career shift from thinking a lot about Soviet cybernetics to doing climate science right now. Right. And what has happened to me is, I think, like, some of the, maybe, I don't know, like maybe scales falling from my eyes is a little bit of an exaggeration. But, I've been sort of thinking a lot about how we're doing prediction. So, like, in studying climate science now, prediction is not about some kind of utopian future projection. It's about hindcasting. It's about historical data, and it's about collecting in situ data. And sort of once you collect those things, then you start validating your models. And by the way, the models are still kind of big and clunky, and scientists are fully aware of that, right? Like, they are messy. Like, nobody's going to put a hydrology model out there and be like, this is it. This is like the model to end all models. And so, but at the same time, the same problems of cybernetics that, you identified, we still persist. They are huge. Like, we are approximating really large things. The problem of governance of natural resources is like as pressing as it's ever been, possibly even more. And so, like, there's a little bit of that gap, because when I used to, sort of spend a lot of time reading Soviet cybernetic stuff, I never saw this issue of like using historical data or hindcasting or any of that to validate models, right? Models were, so I'm wondering if there's like that epistemic thing that happens there that kind of, I appreciate that you identify all these different epistemologies of models and different scientific communities and how they're created. But I guess it still kind of takes me to that weird predicament that I often find myself in, and thinking about, like, cybernetics were trying to do all the things we're trying to do now, right? Except for now, I feel like we invest something very different into our tools. So this is kind of a vague question, but like, what do you think that is? Like, is there like a way to really put, to my mind, it has to do with like historical models and not investing too much into them. But I don't know if you have an easy answer for that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dana. And yeah, so it's really interesting. So so climate or environmental models, we can be done, okay, they're done for dual purpose. So one is they can be used as heuristics, so they help to work out the structure of interacting processes and which ones are more determining than others. And they could be predictive, where we try to produce hopefully valuable data about how stuff might look in the future. Yeah, so calibrating models on the basis of past data was indeed done for the environmental models at the Computer Science Center. But I wonder if Teresa actually could say a little bit more, because you worked with Jonathan Oldfield, and he was looking a lot at the climate history and climate paleontology. What is that very difficult? But it's kind of more historical, more data-oriented approaches to understanding climate rather than modeling.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think the graphical understandings of environment and climate change, particularly in Soviet Russia, so that there's definitely like that historical body. Just my own impression. Sorry, I'm not sure I'm specifically answering the question. I'm just going off into. There was always a sort of sense that Russians weighed, or the sort of the Soviet experience meant that the computer modeling was weighed kind of differently compared to in the West. So it was part of a tradition that was much more in tune with like historical record data Whereas in the West, there was more of this kind of like, look, we've got a snazzy new computer. Look how amazing it is. Let's ignore everything else. So to me, it always sort of felt like it wasn't even necessarily scientific. It was almost like the aesthetics of science, like what kind of science felt right, what fitted with your worldview. And I always think that actually, particularly when you look at the culture wars and understandings of climate change, there's something much more visceral about what feels true. And I kind of thought Egle's book actually, to me, was really quite useful in terms of science communication, because it recognized that different people from different eras and different understandings of science have a very different understanding of what feels true. So if you have quite a positivistic understanding of the world, you're looking for a billiard ball model of we pull this lever, this happens. If you're someone that has dealt with complex systems and computing your whole life, you're much more comfortable with this is an incredibly complex system that's trying to balance and we might knock it off. And I sometimes think like we can get too rational about these things, particularly when we're thinking of governance and democracy. And actually, lots of people are making these decisions quite viscerally about what feels like it fits with my ontology of the world. I don't know if that helps. That was what I was thinking while you were talking.
Yeah, and I was just, I'm not sure if I remember correctly, but I think part of Oldfield's argument was that one of the reasons why Budiko, the Russian climate scientist, was a bit ignored by the international climate science community late in the 70s and 80s is precisely because he was using the data-driven approach to climate dating rather than modeling, and he couldn't do modeling because the computer power was fairly limited. But now it's a kind of renaissance of that approach because the computer power has been so much amplified, so they can actually be calibrated against large and large amount of data. And suddenly all the data that Budiko and his teams collected is now very valuable because it's quite robust, and its usefulness suddenly became evident that both approaches, computer modeling and this paleontological, yeah, sorry, it's a very difficult term that they can be combined. So my understanding is that it's been like an epistemological shift to combine both, which was not necessarily was the case, for instance, in the 80s. But I was also thinking about what Teresa, you said about this political effect of data and what is credible. And I don't think it would, any climate scientist, I wonder what you, Diana, I think would consider a good strategy for science communication to come out and say, oh, look, our models are clunky, they are very complex, we don't really understand what's going on there. So we like surgeons or doctors, they share all sorts of stories of failures, however disastrous they might be internally, because that's how you keep your professional competence running. But you are very careful about what you disclose, what kind of uncertainties and failures you disclose. And I guess the thing with predictive knowledge is that once you start providing predictive expertise, its failures will always be very public, and that's what makes predictive science so vulnerable in the political context.
I mean, yes, sorry, I'm loving this discussion. I think that even further than that, right? Like there's scales of failure, right? A model individually is okay to, you learn and you change and you adapt your model and so on and so forth. But then, there's always this kind of tension with the fact that, you were saying, well, we have all this data now that can be stored, and sort of our capacities, our computational capacities are so much better. Well, they are and they aren't. Like if you're working, like we have projects all over the world, and if you're working in different settings, those, like who's going to host your data? Who's going to host your model? It's a huge issue. right? And so that's still not kind of a solved problem by any stretch of the imagination. And then, you know, those pesky social and geopolitical contexts always make their way into whatever you're doing. And so it's not like you can even sort of separate out like where the failure was because of the model and where the failure was because the model was inappropriate for the context. And so like, I don't even know if I could separate out that like objective knowledge so harshly to say like, you know, this is a clunky model, and then it's sort of a both and then some, right? Which is, I guess what we've learned with Soviet cybernetics. So, you know, the problem persists. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So let's move on to next question. Reni Hahamovich.
Hi, thanks for this really wonderful panel. I'm super excited to read this book. It looks really incredible. I'm a historian of the Soviet American space programs, and particularly how they understood and tried to engage with the future through planning and other practices within the programs. So I'm always thinking about prediction and things like this comparatively, and how these looked in different contexts, if they look different in different contexts. So something I was wondering about is, you know, did you find something particularly socialist about any of it, or what was their understanding of socialism? How did it factor in as an influence, as an obstacle, as a whatever, in these various histories? Something that I've noticed in my own work, like on the American side, is that they were, I'm talking about like NASA planners, space industry planners, aerospace intellectuals and whatnot, were amazed by Soviet planning, that they really felt inferior, that the Soviet planners had some kind of almost mystical engagement with the future, that they were like better at it. The Soviet system, for various reasons having to do with socialism, which were kind of vague in their understanding, could just engage with the future better, and that they felt like in a capitalist system or in a democratic system, depending on which thinker, they just were unable to do this. So anyways, I'm just curious about what was the socialist element in it all, if there was one. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So this kind of planning mystique and maybe the secret knowledge that Soviet planners, as these socialist planners had, and somehow didn't practice, right? But this kind of nagging suspicion, what if we do practice it, maybe in the military sector, and here we are lagging behind, or maybe it's all part of great plan. Yeah, so that is really, really interesting. I see that Adam Leeds is here, so maybe he would be able more to speak to that interaction of how planning was perceived mutually during the Cold War. But I think what is really interesting about the socialist component is that I guess purely epistemologically, I would struggle to see any particular significant difference between Western discourses and what was going on in the Soviet context. So for instance, Kondratiev, he was dealing with the issues that were also studied at business cycles institutes in Western Europe and US. Shadrovitsky, he was working with cognitive psychology, group dynamics, one would say, kind of mathematical approaches to psychology. Yeah, Moiseyev, again, so much embedded into kind of global environmental economy or environmental politics debates. So maybe what would make it different is perhaps reliance on market mechanisms to install self-organization. So the value of self-organization would be recognized, but not monetary self-organization, I would say. So for instance, with Shadrovitsky, it was very interesting. So if you have a problem of failing dysfunctional large kind of management systems, if you're kind of trying to economically plan a regional economy, or if you are building a complex object like a nuclear power plant and nothing seems to work, how do you try to motivate people? Do you offer them more money? No. It's socialist. You try to find a new way for the managers and maybe middle managers to form a coherent collective. So we project the roles into the future in a more cohesive way, and hopefully that results into a more coordinated management and construction activity. So this kind of trying to solve things through money, I think that's something that is quite absent. Or with myself, it's more interesting because he did consider market-like approaches to, or kind of allocated in freedom to individual decision when facing the threshold of complexity. So how do you negotiate between very many conflicting economic interests, and how do you negotiate them so that we all coalesce into some sort of environmentally viable whole, so we don't destroy the environment. You can't tell everyone what to do, but maybe you can create an environment where people eventually work out what they want to do. So this kind of scoping out kind of indirectly regulated space for individual decision would kind of make it more safe, closer to Western forms of liberalism. But even here, I don't remember, but now interesting to go back and look, if he would have tried to monetize it. So money as an instrument for self-regulation just doesn't seem to appear. And that's what makes it actually very interesting, all of those models where prediction and information has to be gathered to make an intervention into social process. But when these interventions tend to be kind of behavioral or structural because of the way in which the Soviet economic system worked. And that's not something I thought about before. So thank you very much for your question.
I wonder if I could add something here. When cybernetics arrived on the scene in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, it was just about the time that Soviet economic planners were giving up their long-term hope that they could actually plan the economy and that would work. And all of a sudden, they saw cybernetics as a new tool that might let that happen. I was there at the time. I often talk to people in Gosplan, and I remember well how excited they were about cybernetics because it was going to permit them to rescue their dream, that they could plan the economy. Well, we all know that failed, and it failed dramatically. Now, the interest in cybernetics is quite different. You're now looking at problems of climate change and ecology and so forth, but there's still a little bit, just a taste of that same kind of excitement, but for very different purposes. Maybe cybernetics can't help you plan an economy, but maybe it can tell you something about climate change and that sort of thing. I hate to sound like a skeptic, but I'm a little bit skeptical about the idea that cybernetics will help that much in predicting and controlling climate change. By that, I do not mean that climate change cannot be to some degree controlled. I'm just skeptical of the degree to which cybernetics will be responsible for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. And I would totally agree with you. And that's partially the point which I make, that one of the reasons why cybernetic approach to kind of rebooting the Soviet economy in the 60s failed is because it was too large a scale. It was a mismatch of scale. Those cybernetic approaches, actually, we really worked nicely at the group management level. And that's why Georgi Shadrovitsky's example is such a good one. But even at an enterprise level, the complexity was already too great to get it working. Of course, Stafford Beer's attempt at installing CyberSoon in Chile failed equally, so just because the threshold of complexity was too high. And the same with global climate change. So I guess the idea, purely epistemologically, one would think maybe you could have this kind of chains of self-regulation and we somehow add up to an organic whole. In principle, maybe, but it would be very interesting to see it working in practice.
All right, thank you. Next question, Dmitry.
First of all, thank you very much. The book seems to be very interesting, and I've already pirated it and downloaded to my computer, even though I cannot promise that I'll read it in the closest future. It's quite difficult to predict, but nevertheless, I'll certainly put it in my reading list of the books outside of my current project. And I have a lot of questions, and then try to limit myself with just two of them. First of all, the question is about the scientific notion of prediction. Your talk reminded me the fragment several times cited by Freeman Dyson about his meeting with John von Neumann and the discussion of weather forecasting. John von Neumann told him that computers would enable us to solve the problem of prediction when the process is stable and therefore it is determined by the initial conditions, and it would enable us to control the process when they are not stable. And according to Freeman Dyson, that was the extreme form of determinism, when you believe that the future is either predictable or controllable, that there are two kinds of processes. One of them you can control and the other you can predict. And I remember, and this is a part of what Lauren just said, my father, during the last decades of his life, was in a project that was a global project of the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union to provide what we would, as we call it today, the informational support of economic decisions. And the project failed. And I didn't know that. My father was quite disciplined and the project was secret, but as I discovered later, that the principal problem was that the people for whom this prediction were to be made didn't want to know the future. They couldn't provide the information important for these predictions. So, what is the scientific what is the scientific concept of the prediction and how far this prediction can be? And the second question is that in my understanding of reasoning in general, as the Polya's book, Mathematics and Plausible Reasoning. So cybernetic, of course, is a strong tool which can trace the future for us. But my impression is that even the use of cybernetic and computer methods, computer science, as it was the case in Nikita Moiseyev's works and his team, that they just tried to calculate the worst scenarios. And in this connection, I can I can cite the recollections of Gleb Pavlovsky, passed away recently, that Gleb Pavlovsky was very effective in making forecasts, but his predictions never came true, because he predicted the worst scenario, and knowing these worst scenarios made possible to avoid them. So this is a different look at the predictability question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dmitry. That's really, your question really goes to the very heart of the essence. So what sorts of what sort of predictions can be scientific, and what happens to those predictions which are not fulfilled because the very point of them is to alert and to prevent certain events from happening. So in the book, I kind of tried to show that first of all, one has to start with the idea of epistemology and what can be known, and ontology of what is out there. So for the kind of predictive mode of view, the key distinction is to what kind of, so there is this real physical or social reality out there, and it's very important to understand if that reality is regular or if it is irregular. So like regular movement of stars, irregular turbulence in the air. And so when the reality is regular, it's fine. When you kind of work with logic, with empirical observation, and then you build more or less certain knowledge that explains those regularities. When what is being observed is irregular, then there is the next question: is it really irregular, or does it look irregular just because of a lack of knowledge, right? So what might look irregular, like, I don't know, cancer, or genetic mutation, once you have enough knowledge, you say, okay, it's complex, but there is a regularity there, and it can be predictable. So this is really the art and science of prediction, this kind of navigation between different degrees of irregularity. And there, part of, so for example, if you have a highly irregular phenomenon, it can be explored actually through scientific prediction. So scientific prediction, as it is defined, for instance, in the tradition of logical positivism, is actually a theory testing device. So there is an irregularity faced, and when you have a hypothesis, a theory that tries to explain this irregularity, and then you try to predict on the basis of that theory what will happen next. And if your predictions hold, that's theory testing. Say, okay, so theory has been tested, it seems to be shown to work. Now we can confidently more or less declare that this, what looked an irregular phenomenon, is actually quite regular, and here is a scientific explanation. So here prediction doesn't seek to predict future itself, it just tries to serve as a heuristic tool for understanding and theory building. And that's, one can say, its internal role of prediction in modern science. But then, for instance, what is really interesting is that it doesn't work like that with prediction in statistics, because in statistics, prediction refers to different types of inference. So what kind of data can be inferred from a particular data set if you follow certain rules? And that data which is being inferred, it doesn't really have to have any connection to reality at all. So it's kind of testing the cohesion of a statistical apparatus. It's really interesting also to trace the discourses in statistics. So sometimes they would use the term prediction, but sometimes instead of predict, they would use the term explain. But then when statistical forecasts are used as part of social information for decisions and so on, then we use the term prediction and we drop this technical vocabulary of inference, when it's kind of, the forecast predicts, or that's being forecasted. And suddenly it looks like it's about the future, but actually it's about data distribution and data dynamics within those particular data sets. So these are kind of predictive operations, or I would say these are logical and technical operations that are used within different scientific approaches to make themselves scientific, to differentiate themselves from other forms of cultural or common knowledge, right? But what is also interesting is that there are, and what I cover, there are also scientific approaches that try to increase predictability in the phenomenon observed. So you say, okay, so this seems to be an irregular phenomenon. For example, people doing lots of weird things. But maybe, or in a laboratory setting, a sample being really strange, but maybe it could be stabilized through additional interventions. So you kind of try to make it predictable. So that's the engineering approach. So you can build through scientific knowledge and techniques a more predictable phenomenon. And this is where prediction becomes deeply performative. So the Shedrovitsky, the Lefebvre approach, it's all about creating a predictable world through the means of cognitive science. And that's something else from logical positivist prediction, and that's something else from statistical prediction. So that's all that I try to show with my book, that once we kind of stop kind of skipping or skimming through prediction as just a word that we understand, but really start looking what's going on there, there is this very interesting epistemological and political landscape opening up.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
I would just like to add that climate change and trying to control the economy, both fields in which cybernetics has been at times a hopeful instrument, are actually very different kinds of fields. When you're trying to control economy, you're trying to think about what should be done from above. When you're trying to fight climate change, you're thinking about what should be done from below. It doesn't require deep cybernetic theoretical thought to know that if you could somehow have more electric cars than you have internal combustion cars, you're going to help the problem of climate change. And that kind of thought could be extended. Those are two very different kinds of problems and require different kinds of thought.
Thank you, Lauren. Eglė, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of clear that you can't, because climate is so global, that there can't be one and single solution to that. And with economy, maybe there is an illusion that there might be. But what is really interesting when looking at the writings of Nikolai Kondratyev in the 1920s, he was making precisely the argument against the centralized Soviet planning, saying that you can't first of all, you can't know the economy as a whole because in the 1920s, there was not enough statistical information describing the economic activities, and there was not enough longitudinal historical data to make any sort of experiments with forecasting future developments. So he was arguing that actually the Soviet economy would have to be planned from below by letting different projects and enterprises to scope out the activities, the way he put it, in relation to minimum parameters of profitability. So basically just to ask everyone, could you please not go bust, really, to be sensible, which as you see, of course, it's not a very deep thought, but Kondratyev arrived at that thought by examining data and facing the information threshold. I don't know. I just wonder what you others think about, this kind of expectation also that science has to provide some very deep and complex insights and solutions, right? It's often criticized, how come, Diana, so many scientists working with climate modeling, and when we come up with those very basic suggestions of what should be done, should we do this scientific exercise, which is very costly, very challenging, requires so many minds to arrive at very simple suggestions? Is science just some kind of clever legitimation of some kind of set of common-sensic truths? It's a really good question.
Maybe, can I propose something since you've invited, you said my name. And I think maybe what I'd like to propose is more of a bridge between what Lauren was saying and what you're questioning, which is, you know, climate change is very much similar to economic modeling in lots of ways. And what science has been doing about it, I mean, at least since Landsat in the US, and I guess the Soviets had their own attempt at a Landsat-like program as well. But you know, trying to model global systems, not just to kind of say change is happening, but like there's very specific tools of mitigation that are also deeply connected to economic mechanisms, right? So if you're going to be monitoring like biomass change in the rainforest, to understand what that's going to mean for global carbon stocks, that's like, you know, that's very much what is, and that has both economic consequences and ecosystem consequences, both local and global. So, and I think maybe that's a problem of visibility of this kind of science, because we tend to get very sort of, you know, climate change, you know, we should all go and sort of recycle or whatever. But there's so much more to that mitigation and the science around mitigation that's been going on for, you know, at least since the 70s. And, you know, and I think that's another history that really needs to be written. And from what I know, hasn't really kind of been looked at nearly as closely as it should be. Like, what does it mean to study the Earth system science, and you know, the various tools that are used for that kind of modeling? But it's like sort of a both and, right? It's an economic problem, but it has that complexity and sort of you are trying to make recommendations to policymakers on local scales and global scales, and similar to something that was discussed a little while ago, a lot of times policymakers kind of don't want to know the real future. They prefer to know the politically convenient future for their own election purposes or whatnot. So, so those are all kind of persisting issues, I think.
All right, thank you. Any other questions?
May I just kind of share a thought, again, like provoked by Lauren? So I think what Eglė shows, right, in the book is that we can precisely move out, right, of these dichotomies. Oh, this happens in climate, this happens in economics, this doesn't work, right? And kind of and see the ideas that are powerful enough to make people think in all kinds of way that we do not always suspect them, right? I think that's sort of how I took it, because otherwise, right, in fact, right, if we start applying and checking out, oh, how did it work on the level of the plan? Oh, no, it didn't. Or when it's not relevant, right? When Soviet history is not relevant because they had planned economy, and anyway, it's failed. And then the political project failed as well, right? And so, and then we go in a certain direction, which is also like a real direction that have taken place, actually, right? So it's all true. But then can we still rescue something from this history? And it turns out that like people have thought about so many things, right? And some of these things were realized and others were realized. And I think, right, so from what I've been seeing more recently in my own work, right, for instance, Shidravitsky, I came across him much more recently, right? So I was really like not aware, but it turns out that in the Siberian context, we have people very much engaged in the game. And then sometimes they haven't even read original Moscow style Shidravitsky, right? But they still do games, All right. And so I think there is kind of an interesting potential for exploring kind of the richness of intellectual landscape. And maybe like, again, it just like came to me very recently when Eglė spoke about sort of my safe ideas. I think it would be very interesting to see how this was translated into some of the maybe failed legislation on how to regulate the environmental pollution in Baikal region. Because I always thought that it was mostly about modeling, but now I'm like starting to realize that they actually thought about limits. So again, right, it may have influenced some of the very concrete local level conversations, people who live on the ground and try to imagine how to accommodate all these actors. Right, and I think this will kind of be a very interesting case for Eglė's idea about different scales and maybe looking into particular region and regional problem, which is simultaneously economic and environmental, could be one of these future scenarios that we can explore. Yes, you know, as Eglė's book makes us think about so many things.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? Lauren, your mic is on. Would you like to add something?
No.
All right.
Thank you.
But it's so great to see you, Lauren. It's I think it's a it's a bit of symbolic to have Lauren here, someone who wrote about Soviet cybernetics. I think the very first in our scholarly community, and then I wrote a bit about cybernetics, and now is the third generation of scholars, and Eglė and Ksenia and Diana working on this, and it seems like an inexhaustible topic, and it's really wonderful to see it alive and so relevant to today's events as you know, we could see, for example, with some of the echoes of Shchedrovitsky's methodological approaches being implemented in you know, today's presidential administration in the Russian Federation. So my question, if I may, has to do more with the kind of the relation between some of the case studies that you presented, Eglė, and more general kind of political and social context, because some of the people you mentioned as a kind of a point man of various approaches like Kondratiev and Shchedrovitsky and Lefebvre, they were not really mainstream in the Soviet context. In one way or another, they were marginalized, arrested and shot, emigrated, and in one way or another, they they clashed with the more mainstream and officially sanctioned elite kind of academic elites. So do you see, do you see this accidental, or do you see some kind of a trend here? I wonder.
Yeah, so I guess this is a really good question. Thank you, Slava. And I guess a bit like Mozart and Salieri thing, isn't it? In a sense that lots of those figures, although not all of them, because myself was very institutionally solid, so we were at the margins. In many sense, we were ahead of the fields in such a fundamental way that we didn't fit. And we also had very special personalities, which probably pushed them into developing those very innovative approaches. And yet it's their ideas that seem to have outlived the Soviet state. And we are still relevant or living in some kind of form and some kind of version for decades afterwards. Although we probably were not institution builders, right? Which is, again, very interesting. We are more like really intellectual figures in terms of Shchedrovitsky. I guess it's a network building rather than institution building. In terms of Lefebvre, it's really the idea that was just appropriated by the Russian military and lived there ever since. And in terms of Kondratiev, he was somehow very interestingly well known more in the West than in Russia in some ways. sort of semi-forgotten, although, well, his career was so very short, just, less than 2 decades, if even that. So yeah, really figures tragic in many ways, certainly not easy fate for all of them. Yeah, that's again such a good question. So maybe I was kind of really working from this little bit kind of romantic notion of a scientist as one who is, somewhat working against the system from within the system. And yeah, and we're a little bit like lone heroes as well. So I wasn't thinking about those historiographical formats. How do you approach ideas and how do you approach intellectual innovation? Yeah, I have to say, when writing a book, and I really wonder, what's your take, Slava? If you kind of make a history book, you don't really have much choice to make it readable. It either has to be about events or it has to be about individuals, because the life stories give some coherence to the intellectual argument. You can, of course, write a very structural institutional history as well, but will it be so exciting to read? I mean, the wonderful thing about the history of Soviet science is that almost any institutional history is very exciting to read for very many reasons. But yeah, I guess I was also driven by this narrative imperative, and that also made me select figures who were interesting as human figures as well. So yeah, whilst I would like to think that this book made an intellectual contribution to the advancement of conceptual agenda of studying scientific prediction, I guess as a history of science with the capital S, I think it's a little bit traditional in a sense that it did drifted to distinguish individual figures, individual scientists, and follow them.
Great, thank you. Any other thoughts?
Well, it's a wonderful group, and I congratulate you, and I learned much from you.
Thank you, Lauren. We've learned so much from you.
Can I ask a quick question? Eglė, you ended your presentation on this idea of kind of shifting from studying risk and history of risk into prediction studies. Kind of, if you had just had like a blue skies moment right now, where would you see the various directions of that going? I'd just love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah. So risk studies are really, really interesting because we are looking into kind of both very technical approaches to risk through actuarial research and statistics and data, and very kind of technical managerial models of how to control risks in the pragmatic level, but also we are looking at cultural notions of risks and how do people get on with their lives with, how do they cope with multiple risks, many of which are uncontrollable and ungovernable. So what kind of cultural and social resources enable them to get on? So I think that if we kind of just shift it a bit and start looking at prediction and predictability, and to look at, on the one hand, this kind of rise of technical approach to prediction and different roles that prediction has for making science more robust, but also for making science more usable in practice. Would it be, engineering infrastructures, or would it be shaping or engineering human behavior? So it's not just about learning how predictions operate in scientific context, but also looking at how the world is being engineered to be made more or less predictable in particular ways. And what is considered to be predictable, I think that was very interesting what you were saying about computers and data sets, and what Teresa, you said about what's credible, what's convincing. So there is some interesting sociological research emerging and also some psychological research about how different social groups approach predictability and how predictability connects to people's social position. In a sense, to what extent we can actually influence or do something about it. So for instance, low-income groups or very marginal groups who face very precarious life, they actually have very high tolerance for unpredictability because we can do only so very little about it. And we don't even try to plan ahead or to try to predict what will happen next because of all sorts of reasons. So there was one great paper, I just can't remember, an American sociologist who gave a talk about, he ran a sociological survey about how, you know, this kind of expectation that things should be predictable and people should be able to somehow cognitively predict the future is very much part of upper middle class culture in the US that is not socially shared. So that is interesting, you know, and talking about political economy, who can afford experimenting with predictions. And once you receive that information, you know, what do you do with it? That information might undermine everything that you do. So no, at the basic level, when people do genetic tests, which are not supposed to be predictive, but but they are marketed as being predictive genetic tests of health, and you get those results. So what do you do? So all those kind of cultural worlds where predictions are made relevant, actively chosen or actively not chosen, I think that could be that would set a really interesting agenda for both the studies of science, but also epistemological cultures outside of scientific context.
Great, thank you so much, Eglė. So let me thank first of all Eglė and also the commentators like Ksenia and Teresa and all the participants of the discussion for the wonderful conversation. And please come to our talks in the Chorus Colloquium series. We'll be happy to see you there. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Yeah, and thank you all. That was